Hi, I'm Manny Fitzsimmons. I'm your Washington REALTORS Legal Hotline Lawyer. Today's question comes out of our Legal Hotline Mailbag. The question is, buyer has asked seller for permission to sample the soil around the abandoned underground storage tank. Should seller allow? The answer is brokers should not. Gigantic NOT, boldface, bright red, multiple exclamation points. Give seller advice on this question. Not only would you be engaged in the unauthorized and uninsured practice of law, but the potential consequences to getting this answer wrong are almost unimaginable. Here's what's going on. Seller has an underground fuel storage tank, probably oil, maybe something else, but probably oil. And it's no longer used, so it's been abandoned. Or maybe it is still in use. I don't really care. It's an underground oil storage tank. And buyer wants to sample the soil around the tank. And actually, I do care whether it's abandoned or not, because part of the answer I'm about to give you goes away if it's still in use. Here's what's at issue. There is both a state and a federal law dealing with toxic or hazardous contamination of the soil. It's super expensive to clean up soil if the contamination is just to soil alone and it's contained on the seller's property. That's an expensive cleanup. If the contamination crosses property boundaries so that the contamination has now spread onto a neighbor's property, multiply the cost. And if the contamination has leached into a water source, an underground water source, then the damages to the seller all of a sudden become exponential. The consequences are really unimaginable. And the seller's potential liability never, ever, ever goes away under either Washington or federal law. If the seller either contributes to the contamination, meaning that the contamination occurs, or some portion of the contamination occurs during the seller's ownership of the property, or if the seller has knowledge of the contamination during the seller's ownership of the property. So imagine a scenario where the underground storage tank has been abandoned, and imagine that it was provable that the last bit of contamination occurred 20 years before seller ever bought the property. So it's not leaked during seller's ownership of the property. And then imagine that on your advice, your real estate broker advice, seller allows the buyer to sample the soil surrounding the underground storage tank prior to closing. And buyer reveals to seller that the soil is contaminated by oil. Now, because of this discovery by buyer prior to closing, seller has a perpetual lifetime, after lifetime, their estate could be liable for the cost of cleanup. Whether that cleanup is contained on their property and in the soil only, whether that contamination is leached onto a neighbor's property, or whether that contamination is leached into a water source. Doesn't matter. Your seller is now liable along with everybody else who's in this chain of ownership with either knowledge or contamination of the property to their credit. How did sellers become liable? Because their real estate broker advised them to allow the buyer to sample the soil. Listing brokers do not ever, ever give your seller advice to allow a buyer to sample the soil. If a buyer comes to your seller with a request to sample the soil around an underground storage tank, do not advise the seller with respect to that issue. Advise the seller to seek legal counsel, put your advice in writing, make it as stern and strenuous as possible to explain to them the potential risks of doing this, of allowing this soil sampling. And they have got to talk to a lawyer before they can do it. Now, it may turn out that the buyer's not going to buy if they can't do the soil sampling. So maybe seller says, well, look, I'm not going to sell if I don't do it, but you're telling me I've got all kinds of risks if I do it. You're right, seller. This is a big question. You need to have legal counsel. I don't want you to tell the seller that they are absolutely relieved of liability if they don't allow the soil sampling, because there are so many nuances to both the state and the federal law. I'm trying to give you a bright line rule in this case that helps you make a good decision about not engaging in the practice of law. Nothing in this video is intended to create for a seller an understanding of what the law will bring them if they do or do not allow soil sampling. This is a video intended to provide real estate brokers a really strict, bright line in the sand that says do not cross and do not advise a seller to allow soil sampling. There's a reason why Form 35 treats this one issue differently than all others. If you read the boilerplate language of Form 35, part of the buyer's right to investigate is to search for hazardous materials. But read down to paragraph 8 of the inspection contingency, and you will see language prohibiting a buyer from sampling the soil surrounding an underground any fuel storage tank without seller's specific permission. Everything I've said in this video is the reason why that issue is called out and treated differently in the Form 35. If you have a question on this topic or any other, send an email to me, legalhotline@warealtor.org. Thank you for being a Washington REALTORS member.